Hello YouTube! I made 52 games in one day. Here they are! The first game has circles falling from the ceiling. The object of the game is to click the circles before they hit the floor. The second game shoots circles out of the middle of the floor. The goal is to click as many circles as you can. For the third game, squares with circles at their corners move from the right side of the screen to the left side of the screen. When the player clicks a circle, the circle disappears. When all of a square's circles have been clicked, the square disappears. The game restarts when a square goes far enough to the left. I'd like to expand this into a game that requires the player to draw patterns. For game 4, clicking a red square makes the game restart. The object of the game is to click the green squares. In the fifth game, the player controls an area effect that pushes things upward. When a circle hits the floor, the game restarts. In game 6, when two circles meet, the game restarts. Click the circles to get rid of them so that they don't collide. Game 7 reverses the behavior of the circles from game 6. Click the circles to keep them from reaching the edge. Since the world certainly has not seen enough platformers, I decided to make a platformer for game 8. The player controls the green square, which is to be moved to the yellow square at the top of the screen. Game 9 is the same as Game 8, except the squares are now circles that move by rolling. A fun feature of this game is that the circle can be spun while in the air, so it propels itself quickly when it lands on the ground. In Game 10, a falling circle gets launched in the direction of the center of the circle relative to where the circle was clicked. Game 11 is the same as Game 10 with two differences. The first difference is that the player swipes the screen to launch the circle in the direction of the swipe. The second change is that projectiles are launched from the right side of the screen. For Game 12, particles are emitted from the right side of the screen. The player clicks the screen to launch circles in all four directions from the point of the click. When those circles hit particles, the particles are removed from the game. In Game 13, the player can exert a gravitational force in the direction of the mouse by moving the mouse close to a circle. When circles collide, they are removed from the game. When circles go far enough in any direction, the game restarts. I enjoyed the gravitational control of this game, and with some fine-tuning, it could produce a very enjoyable experience. In Game 14, when circles collide with the target in the middle of the screen, the game restarts. The player can exert a force on a circle by moving the mouse close enough to the circle, causing the circle to move away from the mouse. Up to this point, I had been creating new Unity projects for each game and creating all of the scripts fresh for each game. This was becoming a time-consuming process. By this time, I had already spent about 4 hours and I had only made 14 games. At this rate, it would take me over 14 hours to make 50 games. I had to find a way to speed things up. It occurred to me that I could have reused scripts and objects from earlier games when making new games, so I decided to make one last Unity project where I would make the rest of my games. I would reuse scripts and prefabs when it made sense, only making new things when necessary. The first game I decided to make in this final Unity project, which is Game 15, ensured that I had scripts for moving, jumping, processing keyboard input, and generating objects in random locations. The player starts with a circle in the middle of the screen, resting on a small square. When the player jumps, the square disappears. Floating platforms move in from the right, which can be jumped on by the player. I continued with the platform and circle theme for Game 16, this time moving a rectangle upwards to force the player up. When the player jumps, a new platform appears above the old one. When the moving rectangle hits the player, the game restarts. An unintended but fun side effect of the way that I decided to detect whether the player was touching a platform for jumping was that the player could stick to the bottoms of platforms and launch the circle very high when moving around either lower corner of platforms. For Game 17, I made a game that moved a rectangle downwards, forcing the player to move down. If the player gets hit by the moving rectangle, then the game restarts. If the player falls too far, then the player will hit another moving rectangle and cause the game to restart. In the 18th game, the player must move a circle to the right, away from the wall closing in from the left. If the player falls, then the game restarts when the circle hits the floor. Games 16 through 18 took a combined time of 6 minutes to create. The difference in speed when recycling things compared to creating everything fresh was huge and definitely worth it. At this rate, making 50 games would only take 1 hour and 40 minutes. Of course, it takes some time to imagine and implement new concepts and mechanics, and I had to take some breaks, so it took me longer to finish, but not nearly as long as it could have taken without recycling. In the 19th game, swiping the screen causes the circle to be launched in the direction of the swipe. When the circle collides with a red square, the game restarts. When the circle collides with a yellow square, the square just disappears. Red squares move from the right towards the circle on the left in game 20. When a red square collides with the circle, the game restarts. Game 21 is the same as game 20, except the player can now click to flip the floor, player, and red square launcher to the top of the screen and reverse gravity. In game 22, the player controls a fast-moving, jumpy circle. The object is to collect the falling yellow squares before the squares hit the floor. The player controls another fast-moving, jumpy circle in game 23, where the object of the game is to avoid the falling red squares. Game 24 adds platforms and a yellow square to game 23. The game restarts when the player gets hit by a red square or hits the yellow square. Game 25 has the player protect a yellow square from the falling red squares. When a red square hits the yellow square, the game restarts. Game 26 has a red square on the floor instead of a yellow square. The player must avoid that red square in addition to the falling red squares. Game 27 has more falling red squares, but this time there is a falling yellow square. The game restarts when the player hits a red square or when a yellow square hits the ground. The player must hit the yellow squares to keep the game going. With 6 games in a row of falling squares, it was time to shake things up. So I made a game with falling red squares. And a cannon! Imagine how many more games I could make with this new recyclable concept. Game 29 adds a falling yellow square to game 28. If a cannon projectile hits the yellow square, then the game restarts. Game 30 switches it up a little with yellow squares falling and red squares moving towards the cannon from the sides of the screen. When a yellow square hits the floor or a red square hits the cannon, the game restarts. In Game 31, yellow squares move towards a target in the center of the screen. The game restarts when a yellow square hits the target. Game 32 takes us back to an earlier time with Game 4's different colored squares flashing on and off the screen in random locations, exchanging green squares for yellow squares, and having the player hit the squares with cannon projectiles instead of click them. In Game 33, the player must shoot a yellow square through a wall of moving red squares. For Game 34, I took a break from the cannon and brought back falling squares. A platform follows the mouse while the player desperately tries to keep yellow squares from touching the floor, which would make the game restart. I made Flappy Bird. Time to bring back the cannon. Game 36 requires the player to hit a moving yellow square with a cannon projectile. Game 37 adds a red rectangle to Game 36. If the red rectangle is hit by a cannon projectile, the game restarts. Game 38 is Game 36 with a time limit. If the player cannot hit the yellow square with a cannon projectile soon enough, then a red rectangle will come in from the right and touch the yellow square, causing the game to restart. Game 39 has a red square move in a circle and a yellow square appear in the middle of the red square's motion. If the red square touches the player's circle, or if the player doesn't touch the yellow square quick enough, the game restarts. Game 40 has 2 red squares moving in circles and yellow squares that appear in random locations nearby the paths of the red squares. As in Game 39, if a red square touches the player or the player doesn't touch a yellow square quickly enough, the game restarts. Game 41 adds another red square moving in a circle and replaces the player's circle for a cannon. Hooray for recyclability! Red and yellow squares are laid out in a grid for game 42. The player has a time limit to click all of the yellow squares before a new grid is generated. Clicking a red square restarts the game. Game 43 increases the time limit for game 42, requires the player to hit yellow squares with cannon projectiles instead of clicking yellow squares, and the red squares deflect cannon projectiles. A burst of yellow squares appears in game 44, allowing the player to click them before moving off screen, and another burst of yellow squares appears. Game 45 is game 44, but with a cannon instead of clicks. Game 46 is game 45, but with red squares that cause the game to restart when hit by cannon projectiles. Game 47 is game 46, except the red squares don't cause the game to restart when hit by cannon projectiles. Game 48 replaces the cannon for clicking again, with clicked red squares causing the game to restart. Game 49 replaces the game restarting red squares with click blocking red squares. If a red square overlaps a yellow square, then the player must find a way to click the yellow square or let it pass by. Game 50 has the player click yellow squares from a spinning assortment of red and yellow squares. If the player takes too long, then a new assortment is generated. Clicking a red square causes the game to restart. Game 51 is game 50, but with a cannon instead of clicking. And finally, game 52 is game 51, but the red squares deflect cannon projectiles rather than cause the game to restart. Man, those last games flew by. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Also, shout out to Jonas Tyroller for inspiring me to make 50 games in one day. Check out his videos. He's a fun indie game developer YouTuber with lots of interesting and engaging content. Bye!